Welcome to OpenGL episode 11 here on Codetech Tutorials. My name is Matt, and today we're going to go over just the basics of getting started out with texturing and adding those to our shaders. And we're going to take the little side-scroller game where we've just been using colored planes and change those into textured planes. And I'm going to walk through all that. Now, obviously, I'm not going to cover every single thing about textures there is, so I'm going to drop some references in case you want to look at more. And we will do more episodes about this in the future on things like cube maps, and once we get to, I guess, shadows and reflections, we can talk more about that too, but that sort of involves some advanced texturing topics. And of course, it also just depends on what you're working on, because there's a lot of uses of textures. There's so much you can do with them. Let's see what it takes to make the basics of a textured cube. So if I go ahead and run this, we'll see we get approximately what we had before, except now it's all textured up. And we see some odd stretching in the center there, but these ones over here look decently tiled. That's not too bad. There is a little bit of stretching on them as well, but you can't really tell. So yeah, our little game still works. And now you can really tell the shapes of things, like how this was built based on the textures. And if we fall off, you can really see how the X was built with just a couple planes. I also moved some of the code around. I basically took all the cursor code and put it into a single file. And that way it could just be called as necessary with just a setup and an update and a render. So with those basic functions, we can just call those in our main loop as necessary, just like we were doing with the side scroller, and handle all that, just abstract it out, because there's no reason to have all the cursor stuff convoluting this every time. Okay, well, so we want to get textures loading, and we're going to do this in our side scroller, within our side scroller program. So it's all going to be done within the setup. But you're also going to notice that we're going to basically add some rendering support for this sort of thing. So you'll see in here texture loader, which actually might have been in here last episode too, but we weren't quite using it yet. So all this basically does is it takes the data from a texture and uploads it to your graphics card, and it returns an unsigned int, which is going to be the way to reference it on your graphics card. So that's the first thing to do, is just get the texture data and upload it to your graphics card. There are some specifications here, and I'm not going to talk about them a ton, but you can go look them up, because it would be a lot. I'll drop some references down below that talk about them, and if there's a lot of confusion, I'll do an episode on just these. So you basically need to set your texture parameters to how you want it to be. The clamp to edge is what is stretching it to the edges. There are other settings here, and there are ways to make it tile across, which might be a smart thing to do if we want our program to look a little better, and if we want our squares to look a little better, because obviously this one in the center, which is kind of probably small, is very, very stretched. So it would make a lot more sense to actually tile that, and we can do that. But it's going to take some trial and error, because I'm kind of just guesstimating on how much. I guess we could calculate how much it's stretched by, and then do some kind of formula like that to tile it. But we could also just turn it into individual squares, but then we'd have more objects to deal with in our logic. So I don't necessarily want to do that. But for now, we're just going to do stretch with this whole clamped edge deal. And just a quick note about these MIP maps. These are basically how many variations it makes. There's a minimum filter and a magnification filter. So basically, it just saves extra versions of your texture for when you're far away or when you're close, depending on how it needs to draw. This is purely an optimization type of thing. I haven't played around with this a ton, but you can kind of notice differences once you have a lot of things in your scene and some distances coming into play. We're not going to worry about these a whole much. We're just going to kind of leave them like this for now. Like I said, feel free to look them up if you need to. Okay, so the most important thing here is we need to either configure it with alpha or non-alpha, because if the texture has alpha, we want to use OpenGL's function text2d just the same, but we want to note it on these two particular inputs. If it has alpha, in this third field here, you need this exact thing, RGB8 or A8. And on this other one, you just need RGBA. So you have to know how this text data is coming in and set the alpha accordingly. That should handle like PNGs that have alpha and that don't, and we can also use JPEG or whatever. As long as we're getting the data in here and we know whether it has alpha or not, we can upload it the correct way. You might, if you get some errors on these, you've probably just set one of them wrong, because like if you try to upload something without alpha to one with alpha, you often get errors. All right, so let's go into the code that actually calls this upload texture. So over here in our 2D game, under side scroller, I believe we've got it in here somewhere. Now this file is getting to be a little bit big, but it basically encompasses this entire little 2D game. So it could be abstracted out easily is the whole point. All you gotta do is just plop it within that loop like we do in our main here. All right, So without getting too distracted, let's continue. This old side scroller, we've got a whole namespace for it, so we can kind of see where everything lies there. And it might make sense to pull some of this stuff in there. But one of the things you can see, and this is just temporary, is I've got a text1 ID. This is going to be the ID that we're uploading. So it would probably be better as an unsigned int, but we're just going to leave it an int. But this, when we call, let's see, let me just see where I call it, upload texture. When we upload this texture, we're going to save it as the text1 ID. That way we can do some other stuff for it. Okay, so let's just walk through this setup. That's probably going to be the best way. So we do prepare our aspect ratio thing, same as we were using before, just using that ortho size. That way we can reshape our window and everything will stay the same. We're going to stick with that method for now, but feel free to play around with it, of course. Okay, we're doing pretty much the same thing with our shaders, except now our frag code is frag textured. So since we're going through this, let's go ahead and take a peek at these shaders because there are some changes. Now the projected is actually exactly the same. Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. It's a little bit different. We've added texture coordinates, but rather than pass in texture coordinates, which we could, we're just going to calculate the texture coordinates based off the position, because this is a really simple shape, so we can get away with doing that. Now, at first I was trying this clamp method, which in theory I thought would work right, but what we get is this weird triangle like so, and not a proper whatever filter. It's just so I couldn't get rid of that using this clamp method, although when I looked at it I couldn't figure out exactly why it's wrong, but it is. All right, so we're going to use this formula instead, where we take the position, add 1 divided by 2 for the x, that's the x coordinate, and for the y coordinate we're doing 1 minus position of y plus 1 divided by 2. So that should accurately get you those texture coordinates if you're using the same kind of plane that we're using here. Where's our plane? There it is. It's just a -1 to 1 plane, which I've renamed this particular variable. That way it's easy to find and easy to know exactly what it is just by its variable name. But ultimately, this is something that we just upload and kind of leave in our draw strip details. That's the only thing in our draw strip details. This goes way back to earlier episodes, but basically this is prepared to have a bunch of different objects in it so we can iterate through it and draw everything at once. Right now we still only have this one plane in there because that's really all we need to do all these effects. There's no need to re-upload the same geometry. You could just stick with the same geometry and reuse it as needed. So let's keep looking at these. So we're doing a texture coordinate based off that. Everything else is the same. So let's take a look at our fragment for textured coordinates. This is basically just like the colored one, except instead of color, we're going to bring in whatever text coordinates are passed in from this guy, just right here. So in this case, we are going to need a sampler 2D of texture. Now this is literally just a 2D texture, and this is what we need to set. It is a uniform, so we need to set it. We need to tell OpenGL some things before it will actually work. So those are the two shaders we're using for this very basic method here. Okay, so let's dive back to our side scroller and continue on, and we'll get to the important parts. So some of this is still the same. We make our shader, we check the attributes, and we set our projection matrix, set our view matrix. I took the look at off of there because we don't want to try to do any angles right now. We're just still sitting at the 0, 0 position, staring straight down the -z axis. We're just going to sit in that position. So uploading the texture. First of all, you need a path to a texture, and I do have one here. It's just that brick one. I might change this before I upload it, so it might look a little different once you download it or whatever from the source code. So we just need a path. So I've saved it to texture1, a string called texture1. And this is a JPEG. It does not have alpha. Or actually, I think no, it doesn't. So I guess another thing I noticed, and this might kind of contradict what I said before, but if it does not have alpha, you seem to be able to upload it as an alpha texture just fine, but not vice versa. So if you have something that does have an alpha and you try to upload it as a non-alpha, it'll bug out. But if you upload something that does not have an alpha as an alpha texture, it seems fine. It might vary some. I'm not entirely sure. That's just something I kind of noticed. In general, it's probably going to be best to just match them. In fact, let's go ahead and use this other texture, which is just some displacement from some other thing, and it kind of looks a little cloudy. But this one actually has an alpha, so we would have to turn the blend on to be able to see that. So I did at some point, I think I had this in there last episode, I did add a set blend function in our GL settings. And this is just something that OpenGL supports. You can turn blend func on and enable. You basically just need these settings if it's on, and if you disable, you just turn it off. So we can call the set blend, and we might be able to see through this texture because it's supposed to be like smoky. There's supposed to be some areas that are just alpha through, I believe. So we're going to go back to our side scroller here And I think we're just going to call that set blend. Actually, we might even do it in our main. Do we call this? Let me see. Blend. No, not setting it anywhere. So let's do this, I guess, anywhere. We could do this before our cursor setup. We'll go set blend. There it is. And we just need a boolean of the status. We want it to be on, so we're just going to set true. Let's go ahead and hit play. See if we get some more background here. No, I can't really tell the difference here, but just be aware for the alpha to actually work, you do have to have that turned on. Otherwise, alpha is just going to be darkness. So we'll leave that there for now since we're using alpha textured stuff. And I could go make a texture and give a better example. Okay, so opening up GIMP here, let's make a 512 by 512. And I'm going to add a new layer, delete the old layer, and you'll see that this layer has alpha. We look over here, it's grayed out where it says add alpha, and we could remove it, but we want it to be there. So we add it back. Now we can delete that. We've got an alpha. So we could do something like, I don't know, let me just do a quick thing here where I draw on some of it, but not all of it. Let's go for this green color. So I'm going to draw on the edges, and as you can see, since I'm paintbrushing it in, it's somewhat faded. As you can see through it, there's alpha, and we'll put a little dot in the center too. All right, so just as a sample file that definitely has some alpha involved, so we can play around with it, let's go ahead and export this. I guess this time we make a resource folder. I'm going to put it on the root, resources. I'm just going to save this in there as demo alpha.png. Another thing that I haven't really mentioned that's also kind of important is you want these textures, these images to be of a certain size. So if I make one that's like 591 by whatever, it might not load up correctly. You typically want them to be of a uniform size and something that is divisible by 4. That seems to be the most important thing, is it being divisible by 4. I believe that to be true. Let me know if you have different findings. Okay, so now we can tell it to load up that texture. Let's go back to our side scroller to where it loads up our texture. And let's get rid of these old lines. It's now just going to be, let's just look at this demo alpha real quick. See our terrible texture. There it is. That's the one we made. It's got the alpha. You can see right through the areas. And in the areas where it's not completely filled in, you can see it's a little yellowish. And that's because it's blending the green with the black background. If we change the background, that yellowish will change to whatever new mix it would be. Let's just do that real quick. I think we have that in our main. Let's set to this clear color. Now you'll see it's kind of a different color. That's because it's blending through with the background. That's the whole point of alpha. You can kind of see through it. It's what you want for like windows and glass and water and things you can kind of see through, but there's a lot more to it than that. It's just a kind of a quick hack you can do to texture in a window or something, or water, is you can use this alpha feature on your image editor. But yeah, there you go. So let's continue on through the code. Okay, so yeah, I'll just walk through this. This is pretty common STB code. STB is just an image loader that someone made. It's a library that you will have to bring in. So if you don't have it, you might need it, and you need to have somewhere in your code where you declare where it's built. And for us, we're doing that right here in the side scroller.h. Obviously, it can't build in a .h file, but we are going with a project setup where we literally only have one object file. You don't necessarily want to always do this. Sometimes you want separate objects, but for the case of demos, all these .h's are basically getting piled into this main. So there's only one object. So long story short, STB actually ends up getting built with our main, because that's where the side scroller stuff builds. But in general, you have this in a CPP file where it builds. So enough about that, but you do need to install that with vcpkg manager too if you haven't, and it should just auto work with this repo. Okay, so we want a width, a height, and a comp. Now what this comp is, I believe stands for composition. In general, we're not going to worry about it too much. Sometimes people try to play around with, oh, does it have alpha or not? We'll go off of that. But you need to tell STBI the alpha before you even get this comp. So that doesn't really work. You actually need to know ahead of time. And we don't really end up using this comp in our case. And I'm not sure if we ever will really, but you do need to pass something there for it to set. Mainly we need the width and the height, and we need to set this alpha correctly. All right, so this basically gives us the data from the texture. So whatever this texture was, the data for it is now all saved in this char star. So then we just upload it using our OpenGL function, which wants the width, the height, the image data, and whether it's alpha or not. And it returns the ID. This one we already looked at, but there it is real quick again. And you'll see I've already put in an unload texture for when we're all done with it. That takes it off the graphics card. So in theory, you could build a system where you upload textures as you need them, and then if nothing's using them anymore, they automatically unload. If something starts using them again, you can upload them. So you can kind of build your own system of managing these. We're not really going to do that right now, but I do plan on doing some episodes about organization. There's just so many options that what's best for my current project is not necessarily what's best for your current project. So you just have to do some critical thinking about that. All right, so once we upload the texture, we can now free the image data. This basically just deletes the image data. You can keep it if you want, because you can do things like modify it, you can walk through it and process it. We're not going to talk about that really, but it's something you can do. We're just uploading it as is and going like that, keeping it really simple. So once it's uploaded, it's on the graphics card, but you're not actually using it yet. So you do have to use this texture within your shader, and you do that with the whole set. And we'll see that here. So let's collapse this setup. Okay, so where we're actually doing all that setting of the textures is in our render. So in the render for our side scroller, first we say, okay, let's use the shader, and then we're going to do this texture thing. Now this is kind of hacked in here. Oftentimes you want your texture settings to be saved with whatever object, that way you can iterate through them. But for now, we're just hacking it and just doing one at a time. We're going to say the active texture is texture 0, which is the default one. Quick side note here, sometimes people set texture 0 as some kind of debug texture, like a bright red texture. That way they can tell when they've missed a texture on their object because it's bright red and they know they need to go fix it. But for now, our texture 0 is the only one we're using. We don't have a debug one, but just FYI, that's something people seem to frequently do when they're actually building a game and have multiple people working on it. Because you want to know if something gets messed up in the final version. It's like, oh, that bright red area right there, that didn't get textured properly. It's setting to texture 0, because you always set back to texture 0 when you're all done with your processing, whatever. All right, let's keep walking through this. Use texture, we activate the texture we want. In this case, it's the first one since we're just playing around. Then we bind the texture. This is the most important part. After you activate the texture you want, you then bind it as the right type, GL texture 2D, and then you give it the ID of whatever one on the graphics card. So we've been saving it as this. So not only do we use the right shader, activate, then bind. And then I guess we don't necessarily need to do this whole use thing until we're actually going to call this set end. So this would be more proper, but I like having the use right at the top because it's the one we're using. I don't know, it doesn't really matter, I guess. All right, you want to set your uniform to 0. This isn't the texture ID. This is, I believe, the active texture. Let me double check on that. Okay, yes, that is correct. You want to set whatever int you're setting the same as this active texture. So keep that in mind. I guess we could do something like, nah, this is fine. Because usually what you end up doing as you iterate through whatever it is, however many textures, is you generally are going through a for loop, and you're adding your for loop to this, and you're setting this like so. But we only have one texture. This is for the case if you want to go through multiple textures and set them if your object has like, multiple textures. I can't think of the right word for it right now, but basically if you've got like a whole PBR set up and multiple textures, you might be iterating through rather than just setting texture 0. Or if you just have a particular object that has multiple textures, like one side is different than the other, this is the way you do it. Another thing there is that we're not talking about that deserves its whole separate episode is sprite sheets. And that's basically where you have one giant texture and you just take sections of it at a time to put on your objects and texture them. We're just using the whole thing for right now, but we will talk about sprite sheets at some point. Sprite sheets are very popular for things like 2D animations because you can section it off as each part is part of the animation and just go through that different set of textures for whatever your object is, and it'll look like it's animating based on the animations built into your textures. So that's often just how 2D textures are done. That way you can use just one square or one plane and just change the texture on it to make it look like it's going through movements. Okay, well I think that does pretty much cover it. As you can see through the rest of this switch where we're drawing, it's basically the same as before. Obviously we're not setting the color anymore. That would error out because we're not using that shader. Instead, we're just setting everything to this one texture. But ideally, everything's going to have a different texture. So what we probably actually want to do is expand our objects to hold texture IDs, and we can upload different texture IDs for them or things like that. All right, well, I think that's beyond the scope of this particular episode. It's already getting a bit long, so we're going to leave this as it is and go ahead and upload it. But this is a nice hacky way. Well, I guess it's semi-hacky. I think I've covered enough for you to expand if you want to. Basically, this is a really nice way to just be able to use a texture based on the same plane we've been rendering all our effects to previously. And eventually we will get into using 3D objects. I think I was just kind of sticking with 2D because it's easier to cover the root concepts, but these translate to 3D basically the same way. I don't want to get too ahead of myself. Alright, that's going to do it for this episode, guys. Thanks for watching. Hope you have some more insights about texturing and can kind of generally figure out how to texture your objects. Special shout out to the patrons from this month. I'll put them up on the screen. There's still time to sign up for next month if you want to get your name on the screen and provide support for me for all the videos next month. It does mean a lot and really does help me keep producing these. And just thanks to everyone watching. Appreciate anyone that watches. View time always helps this channel grow, as do likes and subscribes, so feel free. Alright, guess that's going to do it. Matt out. Hope you have a good day.